Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Appearances from this, and this would be something upon approval of the plan would be detailed dimensions showing all that with the city building department to make sure all the appearances are met to bring the fire code compliance. Sheet E83 shows the front elevation of the home with the reference to the dash line being the existing roof line. So the roof line is being brought down over 5 feet to 35 feet, 10 inches tall. For clarification there, the baseline elevation of that is the midpoint grade elevation that's at the front of the home. We did survey verifications of this, and it comes basically right where the steps come to the sidewalk. So that's where all these baseline elevations are generated from. You can see there, and I'll go through the height slide a little bit later, showing detail where new height's located.
Jesse, can you go back one page for me?
Yep.
So the circle that you drew, maybe I just don't understand. Can you tell me what it means where it intersects with the existing gray area of the house?
So where the existing grade area is, that's a flat roof cutout, and I might just.
So that's right now where the roof goes? Is that what that reflects?
I'll pull up my model here. So what that would be is a roof cutout here to maintain 10-foot of clearance in a diameter in all fashions. That's what that circle is. So it's not just 10 feet here, but not 2 foot over. And these are clarifications that we're going to share today. This here is a 112 slope with flat roof detail in there. That's all EPDM rubber membrane to make sure it leaks. This section of roof would have to be foam insulated to maintain your energy requirement for ceiling spaces. These are all things that we've been working on coming out of the solution.
Vertical faces, it's hard to tell from this model view. Is that EPDM or is it a different material?
EPDM coming up the side elevation of this, mainly for a function, I feel. EPDM only requires to come up 6 inches off the horizontal surface. You need to do a turn bar detail. Based on its proximity to how this is going to be viewed, we feel like it makes sense to make sure that there's not a water infiltration issue.
Are you able to zoom in on that cutout a little bit closer?
And I said at the opening of the meeting we were all supposed to say our names. So I asked the first question. This is Tom Keller, and it was board member Rob Collins that asked the second question.
Correct.
Finally getting my own rule right out of the shoe.
So with it being black, it's hard to tell, but you're saying there's a 6-inch vertical surface between the 1 to 12 slope versus the other materials?
There's a 112 slope from the top of the fascia back to this point where the wall is, and then this wall here is 2 foot 6 inches of EPDM concrete. That makes sense. So elevations here, we're showing front elevation, again, as it relates to that dash line being the current top of a ridge height. Kind of talked about our baseline elevations and how that got to that point. This is the side elevation, southern elevation of the home. This would be the west elevation and the north elevation. In talking with Diane and just having a better feel of space and how it relates to the 2 adjoining properties, we worked with her to put together this representation showing the heights of the home as they relate to one another, as well as separation between the 2. So, and the one thing here is all these heights, again, we're referencing back to that baseline grade elevation. Obviously, the topography of the site varies slightly between house and house. Is there any other questions with this portion of it before I go to the slides?
Oh, yeah.
So, obviously, the 11 points that fall under the standards, 24, 52, 07, 04, is what we're going to highlight majority of the rest of the presentation with. This here is showing the difference between the two front elevations as the roof line in the home sits now, as compared to the proposed, trying to get the same aspect ratios between the two. Some of the defining characteristics of the home. The home is a Colonial Revival inspired architectural design. Again, like we discussed, the use of contemporary materials that fit well in the historic neighborhood, but still practical in today's environments. It's similar to homes in the McKennan Park Historic District. In the National Register of Historic Places inventory, it highlights that McKennan Park is filled with eclectic and substantial homes which typify the district, and we feel like the home definitely falls in that category with others around it. The window details are Anderson Florence series, double hung windows with mullion details to separate some of the glass openings, just provide some more detail. Wood front door, very typical of the district with transepts and side lights. Lap siding and corner boards is the detail throughout the home. Covered porch with railing, and a covered porch being with round columns. Just some pictures of the home details. So I want to discuss the standards. Compatibility of design. We feel like the home is very compatible with other homes in the district. We're going to touch on a few of them here. 1324 East 21st Street. This is a picture of this home here. We feel like the rhythm and scale is similar between the two homes. The materials are very similar between the two. Color, railings, and roof shape are very similar. This home actually originally had round columns, which we'll reference in a different picture, which kind of makes the home feel very similar between the two. 221 East 21st Street. This home we feel like has very similar placement and scale of openings. The materials are all very similar with the exception of the shutter details. Obviously different colors, a little bit more ornamental detailing on this particular home. But again, we're not trying to replicate a historic home. We're trying to put a modern take that fits well in its surroundings. It's a similar roof shape with the hip roof detail. 1601 South 2nd Avenue. Again, very similar color, similar proportions, and rhythm and scale are kind of all blending with what the design is. 1613 South 2nd, again, hip roof detail, lesser openings, a little bit more dental detailing on this. This is a brick exterior with the eyebrow dormer, similar detailing to what we have here. 1619 South 2nd, again, proportion, rhythm and scale, and roof shape, all similar. The neighboring house, 1325, similar roof shape, similar eyebrow dormer to the two new ones that we're proposing. And 1310 South 4th Avenue, in proportion and roof shape. Height. As referenced in paragraphs 15 and 16 from the state Supreme Court court order, the new construction of the home is limited to 36.08 feet. This is determined based on an average height of 32.84 feet, being no greater than 10% above this average. The new height of the home is at 35 foot 10 inches, so under the maximum height for the home. It shows the existing home as it relates to the new proposed design, showing the differences between the two. Width. The subject property, Rs 1323 South 2nd Avenue. The width of the home is 46 feet 6 inches. North setback is 5.93, south setback is 16. I've listed the setbacks on here because I feel like as a majority of the homes in the park use the space that they're given when designing their home. And we'll reference some of the other ones, how they're similar. This is a corner lot here, so this width is 39 foot 9 inches, north setback being 12 foot, and the south setback being the minimum 25 feet for a corner lot. Lot width here is 76 feet 5 inches. Adjoining property to the north, 3221, width is 39 feet 8 inches, or 39.8 feet. North setback is 12.7 feet, south setback is 2.1 feet. All of this information was based on surveys. This information is adjacent property to the north, 1319 South 2nd Avenue. Width is 45 foot 6 inches, with lot width being 80 feet. 221 East 21st is 75.7 feet wide, with setbacks being quite large based on the lot size. Proportions. If we look at the existing proportions as it relates to the size of the home, it's roughly a square ratio. That 23 to 22 references the width as compared to the height. In our new design, the ratio gets dropped down to 22 by 18, or 23 by 18. And these squares, as it compares to these overlays, are a direct proportion related to these particular homes. So that's 1619 South 2nd Avenue, 1601 South 2nd Avenue, 1613. Rhythm and scale. We feel like the placement of the openings, or placement of the windows and openings in the house, giving that kind of light, airy feel, bringing all the natural sunlight in from the east, represents well on the design of the home. This is a similar home at 503 East 21st, of just using window openings to bring light into the space. 221 East 21st Street, again, bringing natural light into the space, and just keeping a sense of symmetry between either sides of the home. 1323 South 2nd, again with the detailing of the windows, with mullion details, separating the grills up with the windows. 320 East 21st Street, again, very symmetrical, with round columns on the covered porch detailing. Window details are a little bit different on this particular home, but again, very close to that symmetry. Materials. Materials that were used in the home are very similar. A majority of the homes in the park. 114 East 20th Street, showing the detail of the siding, and a lot of these homes obviously built on either brick or stone foundations. Those are something that we felt like added a little bit more charm to the home versus seeing some 3 foot of concrete on the side of the house, as well as the porch detail. That's something that we implemented in the design to just bring a little more charm to it. 304 East 19th, again, showing siding details, window wraps, very similar. 324 East 21st, again, we showed this kind of for that overall rhythm and scale. Again, a lot of the same detailing, very similar to this. Color. We touched on a lot of yellow houses in the park. So here's just a few that are all in the historic district. Details and ornaments. Again, we talked about detailing on the windows, bringing some separation to the space to help bring some balance to the large window openings. Eyebrow dormers on the roof to break up the roof plane and just give some visual appeal and interest. 324 East 21st Street. Again, like we were saying before, the original columns on the home were round columns, very similar to what we're looking at now, but very similar railing detailing on this particular home, and a lot of some of the initial designs are referenced off of. Again, we talked about the covered porch with the round columns, again, very similar to the 320 East 21st Street. Roof shape and skyline. Hip roof detail would highlight some homes in the neighborhood as well. 1310 South 4th, 1619 South 2nd Avenue, 1613 South 2nd. Setting. So we touched on in the plan of kind of showing the setting of our setbacks, making sure they're in compliance. As far as front yard setback, we feel like it's in the proper location with respect to the adjoining properties. The front covered porch is an identical, same line as the front elevation of 1325 South 2nd Avenue, and the main part of the house is directly in line with the front entry or front part of the house of 1325. Sorry, I said that wrong. The covered porch is in line with 1321. And the house is in line with 1325 on the south side. This can better be shown here as it relates between the two front elevations. Again, the front setback to the porch is at 30 feet 10 inches, well within the city zoning standards, which is 25-foot minimum. So I feel like the home is in the correct location. The property line as it sits between 1321 and 1323, that survey pin there shows the property line as it sits between the two homes. 1323 is 5 foot 11 inches, 10 3/4 on that tape. And 1321 is 2 foot from the property line, so that's where the 7.93 feet distance between the two homes comes into play. Here's a copy of the surveys for both 1323 and South 2nd Avenue, as well as 1325 South 2nd Avenue. This survey here does not include additional buildings that have been built since the 91 survey. So the relationship to the home as it is to the lot, the percentage of the home's width to the width of the lot on 1323 South 2nd Avenue is 68.8%, as compared to the survey of 1325 South 2nd is 70.1%. So they're very similar percentages as far as the width of the okay, yeah, 1321, that's the table on that top one. But they're similar width as a proportion to the lot width. And like we were saying before, a lot of these homes were built based on the size of the home. That's what's dictating their widths. Here shows an aerial view of the settings of the three homes. Again, the original historic homes at both 21 and 25 have been since added on, very much similar with the district and encompassing the majority of the lot. This is an existing elevation from 25 foot from the curb line on the street at the park, showing an existing picture of what that front elevation looks like between the three houses, and then the elevation or the rendering below shows the proposed elevation of the three houses as they relate to one another. Landscaping ground cover. use of landscaping around the home to soften the where the ground meets the bottom of the foundation. Details have been done. Use of paver walk as it comes to the front porch has been done. We feel like it ties the home very well into the park-like setting that is across the street. So that's those are the slides I have today. For any questions you have, we can go over those now.
Does the board have questions now? Would the board rather hear from some others before they ask questions of the applicant? Any sense of anybody right now? Jesse, thanks. I think what I want to do is hear from some other people. I mean, that might be questions a little bit for us, or yeah, but
Sounds
you
good.
don't get to leave yet.
That sounds good.
All right. Thank you. We would invite comments from the public on the proposal that's in front of the board today on 1323 South 2nd. I'm going to let you start, Mr. Johnson.
My name is Steve Johnson. I'm a lawyer in Sioux Falls with Johnson, Janklow, and Abdallah. And we have represented the McDowells in this matter for about 3 years. I know that there are 7 new board members that were not involved in the initial application. Sure. I know that there are 7 different board members than there were 3 in some years ago. And because I have been involved in this thing for that long, and the board obviously wasn't involved in the litigation aspect of it, I think it's important to give the board some history as to how we got where we are today. And so I'd like to do that if it's okay. Much of what you saw today, in fact, I suggest probably 100% of it was never presented to the original board. It was never presented to the trial court. It was never presented to the Supreme Court. In fact, this drawing about this cutout that they now are suggesting that they could put into this house, we didn't get until about 10 minutes before the hearings started today. That's kind of the way this thing has gone. Let me just show you. I guess I could use this. This is what your board was shown over 3 years ago as to what this was going to look like. Obviously, that isn't what was built. This was a design by Bob Natz. There was nothing given to the board that showed this structure with regard to adjacent structures. As you can see, it was shown that there would be trees and all kinds of space between this home and the McDowell home. The board nevertheless discussed this with the Sapienzas at the time. And by the way, what I'm about to tell you isn't just my recollection of what happened. It's in the trial transcript. This case was litigated fully. Both parties had their day in court. Both parties were represented by counsel. Both parties put in whatever evidence they wanted to with regard to the same issues that we're talking about here today. And so what I'm telling you is in the transcript of the trial. The testimony was that the board asked Mr. Sapienza some questions. His representations to the board were that there would be more green space after they built their home than the home that was there that they were going to remove. It showed trees. It showed different siding. And ultimately, the Sapienzas and Mr. Nance parted company. When they parted company, they took the drawings that Mr. Nance had done, gave them to their builder, Mr. Sorum, who is not an architect, who had never built a home in the historic district, who wasn't a draftsman even, a very nice guy. But they asked him to redraw the drawings, and he redrew all of them. And the others were basically thrown away. When Mr. Nance found out about it, there were 100 and some changes that were made, including moving the house closer. A lot of changes that should have come back before you. Your rules require that if there's going to be material changes, that the people have to come back and reapply and get those approved. That never happened. They took those drawings that were then redone by Mr. Sorum and had him build this house. When my client found out about it, he asked Mr. Sapienza, would you please put your driveway on the north side to have greater separation between the homes? And this is in the court testimony. Mr. Sapienza told him no, because of principles of feng shui. That feng shui would allow negative energy from the north, and therefore they would not put the driveway on the north so that they could have a greater separation. Now bear in mind that without having a context, a scale of how this house fit into the adjacent properties, all of these analyses are meaningless. You can't compare something to something across the park and say that it fits for scale. You have to look at what the house looks like where you intend to put it. When it was discovered that this home was being built in violation of your rules, in violation of South Dakota law, and by the way, the historical standards are not a wish list, they're not permissive, they're mandatory. It's South Dakota law. When that was discovered, we were asked to look into the matter, and we wrote the Sapienzas. May 8th, 2015, which is almost 3 years to the day where we are now. And we told them that they were building a home in violation of the law and that they should stop. And at that point in time, there weren't any windows in there, no doors, no electrical, no plumbing. It was basically a shell. They did nothing to stop construction. They never sought counsel. They never sought an architect. They never went back to the city to find out, well, what should we do? They kept right on going. At that point, my clients had no choice but to file a lawsuit. And so that you are aware of the motivation behind this lawsuit, it was not for money. Most lawsuits are. This one was not. It was for injunctive relief. Relief to require this home to be built in accordance with South Dakota law. They never asked for a penny. All they wanted was to have this home built in accordance with the law to preserve the integrity of their home, which, by the way, was a landmark home, the highest designation you can have in a historical district. Their home has been there for almost 100 years. And to preserve the integrity of the McKennan Historical District. That's why they brought this lawsuit. So, we litigated that case. We had a trial for 3 days. I deposed every member of this board under oath, not one, after having been shown the diagram that they were shown and what was actually built, said that they would have voted to approve the home as it currently exists. Not one board member of the whole 9 said that they would have approved. Frankly, the board was misled. The Supreme Court found the board was misled right in the Supreme Court opinion. they referred to various misrepresentations that were made. So we're not trying to suggest that this board wasn't trying to do the right thing. But as I asked each board member, I said, do you expect the people that appear before you, even though they're not under oath, to be honest and truthful so that you can rely upon those representations? And each board member said yes, as well they should have. The court, after 3 days of trial, after reviewing the law, ruled that this home violated a number of aspects of South Dakota law. And I asked Diane to get each of you one of these so that we could look at it together. And bear in mind, and I think this is really critical, what the applicants want is a redo. They want another bite of the apple. They want to retry the lawsuit. Well, that isn't the way it works. There's a principle called res judicata, which means finality. This case was tried, it was appealed, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the findings of the trial court, and this is not a redo. What you heard earlier today was an attempt to redo what wasn't done previously. And this board, nor can anyone, overrule the South Dakota Supreme Court. And the court has ruled. But what did the court rule? The court ruled that the home was too large with regard to adjacent properties, that it was dominating, and that word, as you know, appears in your admonition with the Department of Interior standards. Is a home dominant? And that's specifically what the Supreme Court found. It was distracting to surrounding historic landscape, violation of both height and width, and out of proportion to adjacent historic buildings. It violated mass. Is there an objection for how does that work?
And I get it, and we do want some history here. Obviously, what we're trying to do today, Mr. Johnson, is talk about, this is the proposal, but almost as though there has not been a prior proposal. How does this comply or not comply with the standards for new construction in historic districts?
Well,
I mean, I think everybody in here is aware there's been some lawsuits, and I've read them, but I couldn't quote you chapter and verse. What we're trying to do is our limited job here, which might not be resolving your lawsuits, one way or the other, but to decide whether this project as presented today complies or does not comply with the standards for new construction. So, and again, I'm not trying to shush anybody here. I want everybody to feel like they get heard, but I do want to keep the topic to what it is that we can and can't do today. And I think that is our jurisdiction.
Well, and not meaning to disagree, however, the only reason that we're here today is because Judge Peckus ruled that they were required to come back to you. And if I have the order, this is the order. The court has jurisdiction over this matter. And the only reason we're here today is because the court ordered the applicants to provide, and there's the order, such renovation plans shall provide plans that will bring the home into conformance with all the requirements of the South Dakota law and with this court's memorandum decision. That's what they have to do. And so
my question is, if they would have come before the board, and I'm assuming you're against the proposal as they presented it today, Mr. Johnson, on behalf of your clients, but if they'd come today with a proposal to change size, scale, proportion, and everything else of this house such that it complied with every standard of South Dakota law, would you be here in opposition to it today, or is there something that you think they haven't done to comply with South Dakota law in the redrawing and redesign of this building?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. And I'm getting to that, but because the other 7 board members are not lawyers like you are, or were not involved, I think it's important to find out, how did we get here, okay? And one of the things that happened at the trial court, and I think will happen here today, is that Spencer Ruff, who is an experienced architect in historical preservation architecture, he's appeared before you before. He testified, he was the only architect to testify at the trial. And he's here. We gave you his evaluation of this new application. We gave that to you. And yes, what they have done does not solve what the court told them they could do or should do, which is address each of the violations of law. Mass, size, scale, proximity between the homes. They didn't do it. In fact, their drawing right on it says they didn't change the footprint of the house. Lowering the roof by 8.5 feet doesn't change the footprint of the house. It doesn't move it any farther away. The mass and the scale are essentially the same, other than you've lowered the roof a little bit. It's still way higher than the McDowell house. It's way higher than the Schwabach house. And so, absolutely, it does not resolve those problems. But I simply wanted you to be aware of the fact that the court asked them to come back for this application, and based upon whatever it is you folks decide, we go back next week to Judge Peckus. We advise him of whatever your decision was, and then the judge takes it from there. That's the way this seems, that's the way this works. But Spencer Ruff is here to answer any questions from an architectural perspective, which I think is, what you're really searching for is my guess. I do need to say, though, that, there's a personal aspect to this thing, as you might expect. My clients have gone through 3 years of this, okay? And because the board approved the home and the city allowed it to be built in violation of the law, as the court has found, these homes are so close together that my client can't even get in between to weed. When she was out there trying to weed, Mr. Sapienza called the police to have her arrested for trespassing because they've got a security camera lined up right there looking into my client's home. That's the personal side of this thing. You can talk about architecture all you want, but the sanctity of living in McKennan Park has to be valued based upon looking at these homes, not in a vacuum, not just by themselves, but how do they affect the people that live there. And this home was there nearly 100 years before the Sapienza home. So that's what I have to say about it. And if there are any questions that you folks have of me, I'm happy to answer that. Again, Mr. Ruff is here, and I would, if it's okay with you, Mr. Keller, he could probably enlighten you on some of the niceties of that.
This is Tom Keller. I don't know if I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, but I am anxious to steer the conversation towards the specific violations of the federal and state law that are, inherent or not inherent in the redraw of this building. And I know there's going to be responses, and please understand everybody's going to get a chance to respond. So if that means you have to take some notes and wait your turn, maybe that's what has to happen. But I would like to hear from the architect.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Good afternoon. I'm Spencer Ruff. I'm the supposed expert witness. I think I can say with great humbleness that I am. I spent the last 25 years of my life dealing with all aspects of historic preservation. With every form, with every document, I've dealt with city commissions, I've dealt with planning commissions. I'm probably best known for my work in Deadwood, South Dakota. If you walk down the street of Main Street of Deadwood, you will walk by, of all the buildings you walk by, I've been involved in 1/3 of those buildings. I served 15 years as a board member on Preserve South Dakota, and I served 3 consecutive 3-year terms as the advisor from South Dakota to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So enough about me. I do ask for a little bit of understanding. I'm a little shaky today. I'm still recovering from 3 days of the results of food poisoning. So my hands are trembling, which is not normal, and I get, because of dehydration, very dehydrated very quick. I'm not asking for you to be sorry for me. I'm only telling you why you see something that you would never see for me. It's not because I'm nervous, it's just a reaction to what I've gone through. I do need to compliment Jesse on the beauty of his presentation. The problem with his presentation is the vast bulk of it has nothing at all to do with what you're considering today. The reason for that is he ignores a really important word in the state law, which is adjacent. I think we all know what adjacent means. Adjacent means this. What he showed you was a lot of examples of buildings that are way over here and that are not adjacent. And if you look at the state law, you will see the word adjacent referenced several times. And so, excuse me, it's my opinion as an expert witness that all those examples have really nothing to do with your consideration. He did address the lowering of the building, which is item 2 on the state law. Don't disagree with that at all. What he hasn't addressed, as Steve has said, is the massing, the size, and the scale of the new construction as it relates to an adjacent building, which is the Mcdowell building. So even though they've reduced the roof by 8.5 feet, the visual appearance of the new construction, in my expert opinion, still dominates and is a distraction to the McDowell house. So that's item number 1. Item number 2 is width. They've done nothing to change the width of the building. And again, I'd like to reiterate, the width of Sapienza's building has really nothing to do, for your consideration, with the width of any other house in the district except for the McDowell house. And what it says is, item 3, the width of new buildings or additions to existing buildings shall be similar to adjacent historic buildings. Adjacent historic buildings. If you look in the dictionary, that means abutting, adjoining, next to. And it also means that there's nothing that separates those two. There's nothing of the same kind that separates it. A building here in the middle, let's say this is the building, and there's a building here, that's not adjacency. The adjacency is next to each other. And you have to keep that in mind about all of these. In terms of proportions, again, it's supposed to be, pardon?
I have a question about the width. My name's Rachel Meyering. I have a question about the width. The language in the standard says it should be, must be similar to adjacent historic buildings, versus the height gives you a nice number of 10% of the average. I was just wondering what your opinion is. How do you use the word similar?
Well, okay, I would give an example of that, which I was going to get to, but thank you for asking the
sorry.
question. Is what building is adjacent to McDowell's house besides Sapienza's? It's the house to the north. The distance between those two houses is 28 feet. That's an adjacent example of the width, the distance between houses, okay? And in terms of the width itself, is the width is what's adjacent to it, which is the McDowell house, okay? Now, there's been reference to the house to the south. What I think is interesting about that, and Steve alluded to this, is that it is not an historical home in the historic district, which seems weird. It's not a landmark structure, it's a contributing structure. In order to be a landmark structure, a house or any structure has to be historically significant enough to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places, even though it's not in a historic district. A contributing building can only be contributing to a historical building, to a historic district. So it's not truly a historic house, it's a contributing building. The third definition is an intrusion, which there are several intrusions in the historic district, which means that it just frankly shouldn't be there. Rhythm and scale, again, what Jesse showed you was a rhythm and scale of other houses, but in my opinion, that doesn't apply. It's the rhythm and the scale of the house that's adjacent to McDowell's, or adjacent to Sapienza's, which is the McDowell home. Materials. I'm not going to get into a picky issue about whether the new materials are present in the historical district, because they are. In terms of color, that's very interesting, because what it says must be similar to those colors on existing historic buildings, or must match colors used in previous historic periods for identical feature within the historic district. Just imagine if all those examples that Jesse showed were barn red. Would you think that Sapienza's could paint their house barn red? Now, I'm not disagreeing that colonial paint colors don't include yellow, but that doesn't mean that the examples that he showed have the appropriate color on it. Those houses over a period of time have been repainted. And while I can't document this, I would, based upon my knowledge of colonial architecture, some of those houses, or maybe most of them, were painted white in the beginning, which is the prevalent color. So if I, as an expert architect in historic preservation, were going to pick appropriate colors, I would go find out what they are historically. And I would do that by going to one of two resources, or maybe both of them. I would go to the historic colors of Williamsburg, or I would go to the Sherwin-Williams historic colors that they have totally documented. And again, going to item 8, what occurs there is the word adjacent buildings. Contemporary design that is complementary to those features of physical or decorative functions on adjacent historic buildings. The adjacent historic building is the McDowell house. It is not houses scattered all over McKennan Park. The roof shape and skyline, again, Jesse's showing you examples of other buildings rather than the roof shape and the skyline of the McDowell house, which again is the adjacent one. In terms of setting, it says the relationship of new buildings or additions to existing buildings must maintain the traditional placement of historic buildings in relationships to streets, sidewalks, natural topography, and lot lines. Okay. 5 feet is not a historical distance. in that district. And if you would go back and look at Jesse's examples, you would find rather generous yards on the sides of most of the houses that he showed you. That is the prevalent feel in that district. In terms of landscaping, yeah, I'll yield on that one. I don't really think that that's a big issue. So, in conclusion, it's my professional opinion that the proposal that Jesse presented to you addresses only one of the violations that are in the judgment of the district court as confirmed by the Supreme Court. So, the other comment I'd like to make, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but we were presented with new information today, 3 pieces of new information. This cutout for the fireplace, never saw it till today, right now. It's hard for me to be an expert witness. It's impossible for me to stand here before you and comment on that because I'd have to go back and study what the Uniform Building Code has to say. So I don't know if what Jesse's proposed really does allow the McDowells to use their fireplace. I don't know. He showed an elevation, a 3D perspective of the 3 houses, the house to the south and Sapienza's house and McDowell's house. Never saw that till it just showed. How do I react to something like that? Well, frankly, what I see on there is between the house to the south and Sapienza's is an appropriate spacing between houses in the historic district. What I see is 7 feet between Sapienza's and McDowell's, which is not appropriate, and what doesn't conform to state law. My other comment is when I first saw Jesse's drawing showing a 10-12 pitch and a 5-12 pitch, I thought, how the heck can that work? Now, realize I'm an architect that started out drawing on pieces of paper. I didn't have the advantage of all this 3D stuff that young architects have. But, you know, I still managed to do that. And when I look at the shape of that roof, and I look at the proposed cutout that he's proposing for the chimney, I would have to say it looks weird. So I open myself up to questions.
Other questions for this witness from the board? So, one of the things you talked about, and this is Tom Keller, and I don't even know if this is a question, but you know, you focus on the word adjacent, but oftentimes in the definitions it talks about adjacent properties in the plural, meaning not just the one right next door. I mean, I don't think you're proposing that they should have designed this home solely to mimic the home of the next door neighbors.
Correct.
Right. It is
In fact, that would be contradictory to the state law itself.
Right.
That's supposed to be complementary.
So what I'm asking is the comment on massing, size, scale, height, relative position. I understand it as it specifically relates to the house to the north. But what is your take as your testimony today in terms of how that should relate to the larger picture of the historic district of McKennan Park?
Well, maybe I'll answer this in a different way, but I think if the Sapienza's house is to remain as proposed by lowering the roof, that it will be an intrusion on the park. The judge himself, and Steve can talk about that, I don't remember the exact language, but basically says, I use the word blight, but I'm not sure that's what he said. So, yeah, I just don't see it an issue of adjacency. I just think that it's too big of a house. And that I would further kind of talk about this. Mr. Nance, who was the original designer of the house, either he or the Sapienzas, or both of them working together, decided to select a style of house that is big and wide and tall, and they put it on a lot that's just too damn narrow.
Thank you.
You know, I am gonna just, because I don't want to get too far afield of this, I am gonna give Jesse another chance to respond to these kind of things, just so that we're structuring the questions. I keep seeing him raise his hand, so I'm gonna do that, and then we're gonna open it up to the general public for people to come up and testify. So thank you for your patience.
When going through doing a lot of research, there's a difference between adjoining and adjacent. Adjoining would be the properties at 21 and 25. Adjacent would be buildings that lie close or near something. And as it sits in the standards for both width, it discussed specifically, as Rachel pointed out, that the height is 10% above the average. The width must be similar to adjacent historic buildings. Now, we touched on historic buildings versus contributing versus landmark, which in the Register of Historic Places, which was run in '84, at the last page, it's actually, there's a pretty good map showing which homes were, shows which homes are landmark versus contributing, and at that time they called them intrusions. In working with the Department of Interiors and truly trying to find out what the definition of intrusion is, that is something that the Department of Interiors actually is looking at removing from these standards, because it's not easy to find what an intrusive home is to a historic district.
Could you hold the microphone closer to your mouth, please?
Sorry. The other thing that was touched on as far as preservation, obviously this is a little bit non-typical from a typical preservation meeting, which would be preserving a historic building. And one thing that I come across when doing some research was the original front elevation of 1321 actually had a different detail here as it relates to the front elevation, which, and I'm not sure if this was done in the last 20 years or when that was changed, but if you go to front elevation, there's a difference by 2 feet on this line here extended over between the two. Sorry.
Can you figure the definition back under there, because I'd like to read it one more time.
Yep. Jason? Close to or near something. And that's when reading through these, it seems like adjacent would be.
But it says your next door neighbor is the person who lives in the house or apartment. It says your next door neighbor is the person who lives in the house or apartment adjacent to you. So basically it says what we just heard Spencer say. I'm just clarifying.
Yep, so go to adjoining. Obviously similar words, and we're using them out of context from some of these definitions.
Things that are adjoining would also be considered things that are adjacent, just as all squares are opposite, but not all opposites are squares.
Jesse, this is Tom Keller again. Can I ask what to me is a larger picture question? It's 7.93 feet between the two structures. What's the next closest adjacent or adjoining structural difference between two houses in the McKennan Historic District neighborhood?
The home on to the west of it, which is.
No, I mean, what's the next closest that any two homes in that neighborhood are from one another? 7.93 feet is what we have here. What's the next closest proximity of any two homes in the McKennan Park neighborhood?
I don't have specific examples, but if you pull up the Google Earth render or Google Earth there of the home to the west side of both garages, and then you go to the south on Second, the first floor south. all of those homes along that stretch there are very, very close to that 5 foot off each property line, which would put that 10 foot in.
Actually, this is Rachel Myrick again. This afternoon I did take this map and looked at Google Earth street line images of 5 addresses with small lots, like the one to the north of the Mcdowell Residence. And it was really interesting to see how that was handled with the adjacent properties to that. Most of those were small houses with small houses next door to them. 1612 South 4th Avenue it does have a house close on the south side, very close with trees between the two. But that house does appear to be just slightly taller. So it was kind of an interesting information or visual for me to see how it was handled other places in the park. So there are other houses that are close, but the mass is not comparable to the mass that we're talking about next door, I would say.
The one other thing in regards to Mr. Johnson's statement as far as being misled, I wouldn't mind seeing that full set of plans which shows the site plan on page 2, which obviously our just rendering on cover page is one thing versus the full set of plans, which would have been reviewed at the previous meeting.
I understand. Thank you. So, folks, again, this is Tom Keller for the record. I would like to hear, you don't have to be a neighbor in the neighborhood. Part of this is the spirit of the community. Our job is to compare this to the standards for new construction in a historic district. But if anybody has testimony they'd like to give, I think the board would find that valuable. Yeah. And with no disrespect to the new speakers, Tom, but we're going to keep everybody to 5 minutes for purposes of public comment, if that's okay, just so we can keep this moving along.
No problem at all. My name is Tom Hurlbert. I'm a licensed architect. I live in this historic district. I'm familiar with historic preservation. I received the South Dakota chapter of the American Institute's Merit Design Award for Historic Preservation in 2017. I'm speaking only for myself today. I walk past these 2 houses nearly every day with my wife and young son. I've often stood in front of these 2 homes and wondered what the right solution is, and I'm guessing that's what you're trying to do here today too. What you're doing is difficult, and you should be commended here for trying to for participating in this board. Second, I know you're interested in preservation and not the ramifications that may surround an issue like this, but I'm trying to think of this if I were in your shoes today. I would try to boil this question down to one thing. I would try to eliminate all the other noise. I would boil it down to historic preservation, which is ultimately why you are here and what you're interested in. You're not alone, of course. Countless communities around the country have boards made up of people just like you that take historic preservation seriously and want to do right by preservation and their communities and want to be stewards of the past and of the future. And they rely on the Secretary of Interior guidelines to inform their decisions. And that's what I would do if I were sitting in your position right now. The Secretary of Interior guidelines, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with, request a thoughtful consideration of massing, size, and scale, and particularly with relationship to adjacencies. I would ask myself if I were sitting where you are, has the historic relationship between the buildings been thoughtfully considered? I would review this proposal and I would evaluate the provided building elevations or building models submitted and then look at those alongside the adjacent properties, elevations submitted, and per the Secretary of Interior guidelines, I would decide if the massing, the size, and the scale was appropriately considered. And if the submission is thoughtfully and earnestly considered massing, size, and scale related to adjacent properties, then we can judge it and know we've done right as stewards of historic preservation. But I don't believe the submission thoughtfully considered those things, and I don't believe this is in compliance with the intent of the Secretary of Interior guidelines, and I do believe it still negatively impacts this neighbor. If I were in your position, I would therefore vote accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Ma'am?
My name is Carla Williams, and I hope you're ready for a non-expert now because I'm not an expert on anything. But I do live in the neighborhood. I live in the next block down on 2nd Avenue. I've been in my house for about 40 years, and It wasn't even an historic district when we moved in there. And later we had to go through very careful process. We wanted to take a tiny little window out once that looked down to our garage and had to go through all that process of getting it approved. And so I know what that's like. Here's what it comes down to for me. I don't need to be in that big house anymore. My children are long gone, but I love it there so much. And the first time I walked in that house when I was 20-something, I went in there and it was a cold, rainy day, and I was sick and my 1.5-year-old son was sick. And we walked into this place and the realtor said, hurry up and get over here now because it's not going to last long. And I walked in, it was all red carpet and all pink walls and amazing light just from every direction, even on this cold, rainy day. And I said, I'll take it. And my husband was behind me, and we hadn't even gotten beyond the front door at that point. And I knew I needed to live in that house. And the realtor said, okay, how much do you want to offer? And I said, all of it. And so we got it, and we've been there. So it was love at first sight. If I think now what would happen if, God forbid, anything would happen to my neighbor's house, if it burned down or something happened and it wasn't there anymore and someone else came in to build, could this happen to me? Could that block out my light too? And I sympathize so much, but it goes beyond just how I feel about the people who are affected by this, because I feel sorry for both sides, frankly. But to take that away from a neighborhood, that security that you have, that we've got people like you who are protecting us from things like this happening to our neighborhood, I hope that we can trust that that will still be there in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is John Roselle. We live in 201 East 21st. And I want to offer you a perspective of how this should have worked. We have had a house next to us for, since we've been in that house, 1976, to the west of us, a little white house. Some folks, the Barneses, bought that house and tore it down. And from the first opportunity they had to get some plans and all that, they came and visited with us. They wanted us to be absolutely comfortable with how that house sat on the lot line. They wanted us to be absolutely comfortable with everything that they were doing that would impact us as a neighbor. And it is about neighbors, and it's just the polar opposite of what happened here. So that was just my perspective for you. Thank you.
I'm Matt Parker, and I'm not an expert on anything. I just like to write things down. My family has lived in McKennan Park for 4 generations now. My wife and I, when we made the decision to move back to Sioux Falls, we started naturally looking at the place where I was born, and my house is next to, my birth house is next to Mcdowell's. Through conversations with my neighbors and that I've grown up with, we located the house that we're in now, 2nd Avenue. That's the house we've been in now for 13 years. When we were updating our home, both internally and externally, we poured through all of the levels of historic preservation, state, national, anything we can get our hands on, including the Benjamin Moore colors of appropriate housing styles. We still continue to research our house. Because we wanted to ensure that our home maintained its respectful fit with the history of the surrounding neighborhood. We did this because we believe that historical neighborhoods like McKennan, All Saints, Cathedral, and our downtown are gifts. That preservation is the way that we take care of those gifts. The laws surrounding the standards of preservation are how we ensure that those gifts can be passed down from generation to generation. I fear that without such laws, vigilance and adherence to those laws, Many historical homes and areas may fall victim to improper development that is not keeping with the standards of preservations that are guarded by boards such as yourself. Threats to the legal framework like this constitute issues with a larger section of our society, constitute threats to the larger section of civil society when we threaten the law that's been handed down to us to this point. My hope is that the board agrees to protect our gifts and our neighborhoods by affirming court-ordered standards and preservation. Thank you.
My name is Mary Catherine Lambert.
Bring that closer or yourself closer.
How's that?
Better.
Now?
Thank you.
Okay. A few years ago, I live in the McKennan Park area. We live on Pender Lane. And a few years ago, we were subject to maybe being a historical area. So when they came to us and told us that there were rules and regulations when you build your home.
I'm sorry, but we can't hear you still.
Can't hear me at all? Okay. When they came to us and they took pictures, they come and visited with us, and they told us that when you come into a historical society, a historical neighborhood, there are rules and regulations. And part of those rules and regulations are the building materials that you can and cannot use. What I have not heard here is what the home looked like before they took it down, what the plot looked like before they took it down. And I think that what has been presented is you're the stewards of historical preservation. And you have to consider that your responsibility is to make sure that this could go nationwide. You know, what if this little case, as it were to go nationwide, and all of a sudden that somebody decided to take down something that was very historical and just demolished it and wanted to build something new, and it was accepted because the historical society, the Historical Preservation Society said, okay. But you were given plans, and then the architect and the builder decided not to go through with the plans that were presented. So what you've been given today has nothing to do with what they originally presented. So I think the only way you can vote is no, because they didn't comply with anything. That's just my opinion. I mean, I wouldn't want the neighbors next to me to not have the option of building a home. But when you look at your lot size, you have to make it comply with what's there and what you're going to put on that property. If you look at their garage, go look at their garage. It's tiny compared to the massive size of the house that they built. And I agree. I think the woman that was up here before put it quite eloquently. I mean, you have to want to be in that neighborhood for a reason, but you also want to be a good neighbor. And we originally lived on Main and moved away and came back, and we wanted to be in the McKennan Park area because we love the style of the homes. They're not cookie cutter. Because back in the day when they were built in the 20s and the 30s, when when it was named for the McKennan Park area, there were standards back then too. If you look at the history of Sioux Falls, and I'm sure you would, you can see that there were rules and regulations when people bought lots, and they went and investigated a contractor or a builder, and they were just good neighbors. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I'll make this real short. I live at 320 East 21st Street, right on the boulevard, right across from the basketball court. And we've been remodeling our house ever since we moved in there almost 27 years ago. And every time we do it, we come to this board and we bring our builder along and we do what you guys suggest. And we arrange it, we change it so everything fits what you say is right. And I guess I just want everybody that does any renovations in that neighborhood to follow the rules, and that's it. So we did, and I think everybody else should. So thanks.
Thank you. Well,
Hello, my name is Alex Hallback, and I live at 650 East 21st Street, which is just a block or so up from McKennan Hospital on the boulevard. And it was about 4 or 5 years ago that I came before this body and requested my own modification and renovation to my home. Included in that presentation was a discussion about materials, about recreating some of the details and preserving some of the details of that home. And I don't feel like we've talked, or that I've heard a lot of testimony today about materials, and I understand that that's somewhat insignificant, as Mr. Ruff maybe pointed out, but I think it's important for you to consider, and it's definitely one of the standards that you're supposed to consider. I don't know that the wide clapboard siding is really appropriate in the neighborhood. I don't know that the windows the way they are appropriate. The doors are appropriate. The scaling, the mass, the size, all of those items that you're supposed to look at are appropriate. Now, I came before this body and presented my plans and was actually denied the first time. And I went back and did some more research and came back to this body a second time and had decided at that point in time that when I presented my plans the second time, that if they weren't approved, that it wasn't meant for me to stay in that neighborhood. As painful as that was going to be for me to leave, I trusted that this body was going to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood, and if what I was presenting was not maintaining that integrity, that it was appropriate that I move on to a different property. I want you to think about the integrity of not only the neighborhood and of the neighboring McDowell property, but the integrity of everything that people move into that neighborhood for. Again, I think you guys have a really important role in this, and it's a difficult one to say the least, but I think it's really inappropriate to be looking at the half house from a scale perspective, and when comparing this property, the Heideprum house, for people that maybe don't know the halves, the Fisher house, I don't think that's an appropriate house to use from a scale perspective. The Eccles home, 3 or 4 houses down, again, not an appropriate property to use from a scale perspective. I think the definition of adjacent should weigh more heavily on the properties to the north and to the south. And when you look at the property to the north, the scale is inappropriate based on what has been presented today. So I think there's additional modifications that need to be made from a massing, a size, a scale perspective, and again, a materials perspective. And I think that you would be doing everybody that's sitting here today, because they're passionate about what's going on, a disservice by not considering all of those additional elements. If just lopping 8.5 feet off the property brings it into compliance, I just don't think that that's accurate. So, thank you.
thank you. I think in the terms of keeping this moving, and again, for the record, Tom Keller, what I'd like to do is have the board ask questions of the applicant as they relate specifically to the standards for historic preservation. So if the board has specific questions, again, for the applicant, before the board has discussion amongst themselves, let's take care of that now. Anybody have any specific questions for the applicant?
As I was looking at Rob Collins, as I was looking at this material to start, one of my immediate thoughts was to shift the drive to the north. As you look at the context of the neighborhood, I don't know that there are other properties that have driveways side by side, adjacent properties. And so my immediate thought was that driveway should have been to the north, and that it could have preserved the historical spacing of properties as you look at the context of the neighborhood. You kind of addressed that. Is there any further clarification that you could give on that?
So one of the reasons was the existing driveway garage where the location where it is now. I know that someone did touch on someone did touch on what was there versus what's there now and how it relates. One thing good about Google Earth is it's before what it is now. So we have a good representation of what was there before, which the driveway and the garage stayed the same. Now, as Spencer Ruff alluded to, that the previous home was an intrusion, which that leaves that kind of up for debate, which is why the board has standards for new construction, which lets you build new construction in the neighborhood. I know one gentleman touched on materials as far as a lap siding being the correct material.
The chimney accommodations, if you could explain that a little bit better. I know that that's not standards, but that would be engineering requirements, so it would allow them to use chimney. How guaranteed are we that that would actually work? Where did you model that from?
So that's based on the top of the chimney being based on the top of the chimney being over 2 foot above the fascia, which needs to be verified. And these were requests working with the city, and again, not a direct requirement as part of the court order documents, but to get how we got that dimension of where that's at would be the chimney being over 2 foot above the fascia, and then the perimeter shows the 10-foot diameter for clearance required on a wood-burning fireplace. That 10 foot is then 2 foot down. What it does is, if ambers come out of your fireplace, rule of thumb is by that 10 foot out, 2 foot down, those ambers are no longer hot. That's where the mechanical would arise from.
Another question, the roof line being brought down to 8 feet.
Yep.
Overall, what would you say the bulk has been diminished by?
It's half. So that, if you look at the elevation here, it shows the current gable end details. There's that dash line above. So it's half.
So the roof, correct?
Yep.
Okay. But the overall building structure?
The overall building structure is being brought down 8 feet out of 40. So
Fourth.
yeah, it's over a 50% reduction in mass. 15. Sorry.
I have a question as well, Rachel Myrick. The 3D images make the house look like it has kind of a flat roof, but the architectural drawing here does not communicate that same look. What do you think, which one is more accurate as how it will actually appear if you're standing at the park looking at the house?
So if you're standing at the park 25 feet from the curb line, if you go to the relationship of the three houses, I guess that's it. So this picture was taken actually 30 feet in from the curb on the street, and by scaling and aspect ratios, obviously the trees make it a little bit difficult seeing everything, but that would be the look that we feel like is pretty close based on perspective.
So the dormers right now are very, they're 90 degrees.
Yep.
So these dormers look like they have a pitch to them, or
Yep,
is
that would
right?
be the hip roof detail. So
Okay.
it's a 5/12 pitch going backwards, and then 10/12 on the sides to give it some presence. In working at some options, we felt like this gave the roof enough scale as proportioned to the rest of the home.
Thank you.
Jesse, Pam Merchant again. Could you please show from 1321 more of an angle going inward? Is that possible to do that? So near to the chimney and just, is there a kind of a street or their front lawn view. Thank you.
Yep.
Board members, any other questions of the applicants? Yep, go ahead, ma'am.
Is there any consideration for color on this as well? Has there been any discussion with?
I mean, we feel like the color fits with the historic neighborhood, but obviously that's why we're here. I mean, we're here for a solution, and that's, ever since I've been working with the Sapienzas, that's what we're here to come up with. So we feel like there's a color that definitely blends better than the current color on the home. It's something that we consider.
Thank you, Jason. Do you want to speak? Yeah. The only other thing we're going to do is have discussion amongst the board and then a motion. So,
my name is Josh Sapienza. I'm a resident at 1323 South 2nd Avenue for a couple of years now. And to open up and address the issue of the color, it was our understanding that the color needs to be similar to those that exist in the neighborhood. I don't know if it exactly matches, but there are over a dozen homes of that similar color family. And we did a survey initially of the park, not only of those homes immediately surrounding the park, but an 8-block radius to decide on that color, especially since the home we had originally intended and hoped to purchase was that color. So, to address that, Ms. Williams, her concern, I feel for her. She doesn't want this to happen to her or anyone else. If they're building within the limits of the law, I don't believe that could happen. I don't believe anyone else is at risk. Mr. Tom Grover, his intent, is discussing the intent of the law and whether or not the law was appropriately considered. Mr. Tom Wiesel, talked about the fact that we presented plans and invited opinion. A lot of these comments, Mr. Matt Parker talking again about the standards of preservation. The resident on Pender Lane said that you have to consider that this can go nationwide, that the builder decided to do nothing with the original plans. All of these comments, Alex Holmbeck, the integrity of the neighborhood is not, as he pointed out, it's not any one property, but the law specifically states how it impacts the historic landscape of all properties, of all homes in the historic property. And the historic district of McKennan Park is itself considered a historic property, which means all of the homes should be considered and not just one. And as Mr. Spencer Ruff himself said, 7 feet is not sufficient distance between the homes. That might be, but it's my understanding that the purpose of this meeting is to determine whether or not our home, with these proposed changes, not the history lesson that we got, not what the original plans look like or anything, but it's our understanding that the Supreme Court asked for additional proceedings. And it was the circuit court's determination that those additional proceedings be in your hands to determine whether or not with the proposed changes we meet all 11 points of the administrative rule in question. Not to amend those laws, consider the intent, whether or not it was appropriately considered initially, whether or not we're going to establish or propose stricter requirements than 7 feet setbacks, or address any other thing, whether it be original plans or what maybe could have been done differently at this point. These are things that are not specifically detailed in these 11 standards. And I would be grateful if we could really stay focused and your judgment could be focused on those specific 11 standards and whether or not the plans as presented today meets those 11 standards as articulated specifically in the standards for new construction in a historic neighborhood in a historic district. That's all I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. So board discussion, and again, I'm going to ask the board members to say their names for the record when they bring points up for discussion. Laura, go ahead.
So I read through this application several times, like I'm sure everyone on the board did. And I read through the standards many times, and I really believe that the home with its proposed modifications has an adverse effect on the McKennan Park Historic District based on the standards for new construction number 10, which deals with settings. And for those of you that don't have this in front of you, it reads, which I guess we all do, so do you want me to read that setting one? Okay. The relationship of the new building or additions to existing buildings must maintain the traditional placement of historic buildings in relation to streets, sidewalks, natural topography, and lot lines. Based on this, my belief is that this home has an adverse effect because it is overwhelming in its relationship to 1321 South 2nd Avenue. It does not maintain the tradition of placement of existing historical structures in the McKennan Park Historic District. So that's what I came up with after reviewing all the information and the standards.
Board members?
This is Rachel Meyerink. I was wondering if perhaps we should kind of just go through these standards, and then if anyone has any comments, we can all just kind of say a comment based on that one standard and then move to the next. So make sure that we're thorough. I mean, I would just like to say that I appreciated the thoroughness on both sides. I thought it was very helpful for us. I too spent many hours this week, late last night, much of today, reading, thinking, researching, calculating, and appreciate the thoroughness that both sides brought. So I will start with, let's discuss the first standard, compatibility of design. Massing, size, and scale of new construction must be compatible with surrounding historic buildings. Now, I feel like the architectural features of the new construction are contemporary. They're not over mimicking and trying to be, confusing as how old is this house. I feel like is well documented by comparing it to other houses in the neighborhood. The windows, it does look similar in some ways to other houses, so I feel like that is compatible. The last sentence of this number 1 says, the overall visual appearance of new construction, may not dominate or be distracting to the surrounding historic landscape. And that's where I stumble. With this, I do feel like it is distracting me when I look at it, and I feel that it does dominate the landscape of that stretch of the McKennan Park neighborhood.
Rob Collins, I also think the detail that was submitted for the fireplace notch out would be even much more distracting, would interrupt kind of the natural look of what that house, what you'd expect it to look like. And as I was walking around the site this week, that part of the building is very prominently seen as headed south on 2nd. So I think I was also kind of focused on that last sentence as well. And I think the detail we saw today just exacerbates that even more.
This is Shelley Schwab, and I'll have to agree. I really kind of like Rachel was highlighted and caught up on that last sentence about it dominating, and I just feel like it kind of goes with number 10 too. I really spent time in the neighborhood looking at the placement of houses and how much space there was, and it is, distracting is the best word.
The second standard is height, which they are in compliance of. The court case gave they did a survey, they determined the height that it needed to be, and it is within that, so I didn't have any comments about the proposed height. The width of the new buildings or additions to existing buildings must be similar to adjacent historic buildings. I wish they'd given us a number. The standards can be a little bit gray sometimes, which is sometimes a little hard to interpret. To me, I wonder if the 10% listed in the height is an example of similar. I did some calculating. The proposed width, or the width of the Sapienza residence is 16% wider than the house on the south and 17% wider than the house on the north. So that's just some numbers that I came up with, or used the numbers provided to figure out. But I mean, it does look large compared to.
This is Tom Keller. The presentation, as I understood it, talked about the width of the house, and there are wider houses in McKennan. But the question in my mind becomes, are their houses wider in proportion to the size of their lot? I mean, independent of where it sits next to everything else, is there any other house that takes up that percentage of its lot as a width measure? And, yeah, I mean, to me, width is not just a number. It has to be less than 64 feet wide. If you have a 64-foot wide property on a 74-foot wide lot, it's going to look funny. So, I mean, I think, and maybe, Jesse, you have an answer to that, and I know we're mostly just talking amongst ourselves, but, and I know you guys did address some of this in terms of percentage of total lot size taken up by the width of an individual's property.
That's a typo on 2.5, that's 21's percentage. 1321 takes up 70.1% of the lot width, as a relationship to 1323 takes up 68.8%.
And so, okay.
Yeah, so the house to the north is why it does have a wider percentage. So that's very interesting. I mean, I think the house to the Mcdowell Residence is an unusual house for the district because it's a very small lot compared to most, and it's a very low or wide, low-set house, which is part of its distinctiveness too. Historic house. So you know, this is the one that's a landmark house. So it's a low, very wide house for the lot. I don't think that there are any other houses in the district that are that wide for that small of a lot, based on when I looked through other lot sizes. But
Rob Collins, I would concur with you, Tom, about, I think the width and proportion go hand in hand. I agree that you have to look at how much of the width of the lot does the house fill. And I think those two go together. I think in establishing that, you gotta look at the context of the neighborhood. You know, we can't look at one example and use that as a precedent per se. So I think when you look at the context of the neighborhood, I think 1321 is kind of is not conforming with the precedent of the rest of the neighborhood.
Say that again for me. 1320.
So I think
the house to the north.
To the house to the north, I think you have to look at more than just the one property to see the context of the neighborhood. So that one house, yes, does fill a large percentage of the width, but as you look at all of the houses within just visual range of the house in question, most of them are much smaller percentages, and I think that establishes the context of the neighborhood.
And I talk about it much more, I mean, and I don't know if this is which or which of the 11 standards, but you know, just in talking to people from your office, people that are across the hall from you, just say, have you seen this house next to its neighbor? And then somebody hasn't actually seen it. They haven't driven by there, they haven't gone around the park, and they drive by there. There's one universal comment. I mean, it is not, boy, that house is a long way away from its neighbors and seems appropriate for its lot size. It is, how in the world could they build a house that big, that close to their neighbors? And, you know, speaking for myself, and this is board discussion, I am one of the two people that was on this board when we got deposed and when we approved that original design, and I was taken in by the trees on both sides, and I looked at the house and said, that's a beautiful house. I mean, that's an architecturally beautiful house. it's appropriate for, there's a lot of real big houses in McKennan, it's appropriate for what it is, it's a beautiful new home, it doesn't try to be one of the historic properties, but it doesn't steal from historic properties. I felt as though the design but then you take that house and you put it where it ends up, I'm sorry to say, it felt very uncomfortable to me that I was part of that. You know, it's not about my personal guilt or responsibility for being there, but I did feel as though, as Mr. Johnson pointed out, I said if I'd have seen that relative to the neighbor's house, I think my opinion would have been different when that came up, and I think that was the universal opinion of all 9 people that were on the board, and you were the other person, Jennifer, that was on the board when that happened. And I think we're here today talking about, you know, its height relative to its size and its width relative to the what. And that seems to me less the point here. And I don't mean to be crass about this, but to me, and this is a little lawyerly thing, but it's like the Supreme Court said about pornography. I'm not sure I can define it, but I know it when I see it. I know it when I see it, whether something contributes or doesn't contribute to the historic value of a neighborhood. And that's my sense of things as we're here. And I get it. Again, I think you guys have tried very hard to sort of make this comply with the rules and thought you were doing that when it happened. And then a lawsuit blew up and all these other things happened. But here's where we are today. Does this house, as designed, massed and scaled and next to the neighbors, and with the change in the roof line and its proximity and massing and everything else, does it detract from the historic neighborhood of McKennan Park District? And I don't know a single person, no offense, you guys, who's ever gone past that house and looked at it who said they feel like it complies and should be there. Not one.
And even if we feel that way, we have these standards, you know, that we're following. And I really, with the width, when it says it must be similar to adjacent houses, I don't think it meets that qualification. I don't think it is similar to the adjacent house.
And to me, of the standards, number 9, with the modification to the roof shape and skyline, that this is a non-conforming roof shape, as Rob pointed out. This is Tom Keller again. The setting, I think, number 10, relationship of this building to the existing buildings maintains traditional placement. Well, I don't see how you can look at this and say this is traditionally placed like a house next to other houses in the neighborhood. And again, number 1, the last sentence, as Rachel pointed out, the overall visual appearance may not dominate or be distracting. And I don't see how you can go past that house and say that it does not dominate or is distracting. And again, as much as these changes might modify some numbers, I don't think it changes the fact that it dominates and is distracting. So again, we can go through each one of these. I don't think we need 1,000 of them, and I have no disrespect to anybody, and I'm not trying to give anybody the bum's rush, and I told everybody they'd get to be heard today. And the chair does not get to vote, so keep that out there. But the chair would entertain a motion regarding the proposal for today's hearing, if anybody's ready to give one.
Rob Collins, I propose the design as presented would have an adverse effect on the McKennan Park District.
The motion is that the design as presented to the board today would have an adverse effect on the McKennan Park neighborhood. Is there a second to that motion? Okay. Oh, it's been seconded. Go ahead.
Can we discuss right now?
What's that?
This is Shelley.
Yep.
Can I add, do we need to add why, and just say based on standards 1, 9, and 10,
Okay.
it has an adverse effect?
That would be an amendment to the motion, and in terms of procedural, I think we would take that amendment to the motion. So Shelley has made an amendment to the motion that it is sections 1, 9, and 10 predominantly that cause the pause of the board.
We can discuss too if someone has more to add.
But again, numbers 1, 9, and 10 being the predominant objections, is there a second to Shelley's motion that that would be added to the overall motion of the adverse impact?
This is Rachel Myring. 9 is roof shape and skyline. I don't think we had discussed a lot about the roof shape being the adverse effect.
The discussion about it was more what Rob had said, indicated that with the cutout to accommodate
Yeah, that part of it.
that's
Gotcha.
not going to be, it's not like shaped like any other roof. So, I mean, I'm not stepping on your toes saying that. I think that's the consensus of what folks were saying. With that understanding, Shelley has moved that we supplement the motion to say that it is predominantly sections 1, 9, and 10 that are the things that cause the board pause in terms of the conformity with the standards of the neighborhood. Is there a second to Shelley's amendment to the motion? Hearing none, the amendment fails. The original motion is that the presentation as presented would have an adverse effect on the McKennan Park District. That has been seconded. I think for our purposes, we're going to ask each individual board member to say yes or no so that we keep a vote of this and know whether there are ties or needs or anything else. We'll start at the end. Josh, would you start and tell us, do you understand the motion as presented that this presentation would have an adverse effect on the McKennan Park neighborhood?
Yes, it would have an adverse effect.
Yes, it would. Stephen Jackson says yes. Rob?
Rob Collins, yes.
Go ahead.
Robbie Merrick, yes.
Laura Rhodey, yes.
Rachel Myring, yes.
Jennifer Dumke, yes.
Shelley Schmold, yes.
Pamela Merchant, yes.
Folks, the decision of the Board of Historic Preservation in regard to the petition at 1323 South 2nd Avenue is that it would have an adverse effect on the McKennan Park Historic District. Folks, we do have regular board meetings every month. Generally, we do take on other topics, and if people are here to talk about things other than the specific agenda items, we generally take those on. We're not doing that tonight. We'll see you next month if you have something other than this project to talk about. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your attendance.
He was right in my line of sight for 2 hours. He's watching the boat. He's over here. People that are still in school. Well, and then you say, look, like that roof is flat until the board member called them on it and said, give us the true perspective of what that roof is. Is that roof flat from docs on seafault.org?
We don't come up here to entertain you. We come up here to inform you.
What kind of morons run this outfit?
Welcome back now. Cheers.